Hi, in this video I'm going to show what's new in Waveform Generator version 1.2. In version 1.1 I added some shortcuts to when you're viewing waveforms to control the playback. And in this version I changed those shortcuts because they were interfering with the entry fields. I used, for example, the keys 1 and 2 to change the volume. And when these fields have focus, when you enter something into them, it would change volume and change pitch and so on. So I changed it to use the F keys on the keyboard instead. So now you can start playback pressing F1. And you can stop playback with F2. Now you use F keys 5 and 6 to change the volume. And you use the F keys 7 and 8 to change the pitch. In previous version it was called octave, but in this version I changed the label to pitch. But the biggest change in this version is you can now filter your waveforms. This waveform, when you export it, it will export just fine, but when you load it into a sampler, you will have a lot of anti-aliasing of the sound, and that's because a sharp edge like this one up here and down here, it will not be possible to do unless you have more or less unlimited samples. So in this version you can both show how the filtered waveform look, and when you export it, it can apply this filter to it. The filter will be based on two things. It will be based on your bit rate, the sample rates, and it will be based on the number of samples. When you play back audio in this window, it will always play back at 44.1 kilohertz, and you can choose down here the number of samples to include in this view. Right now I set it up to the lowest value, it's 128, but you can pick a value from this combo box, or you can enter a value yourself between 128 and 2048. And you can dial in the filter strength. The filter strength will default to 0, meaning it's not filtered at all. But you can dial in values between 0 and 100. In most cases, just setting the filter strength to 1 would filter the waveform enough to get rid of the anti-aliasing. But if you want to filter it even more, you can dial in a higher value. So here I'm using the scroll wheel in this field. If I set it to 0, you see we have no filtering at all. And if I just click a single time or manually enter 1, you see this is how the waveform look when it's filtered. And if you apply even more and more filtering, in the end it will just turn into a sine, as long as we only plan to export it with 128 samples. If we go back to 0 and I instead say I want to export it with 600 samples, now you see when I set it here to 1, it will need less filtering. And that's because what we are showing here is a full waveform. We don't we don't think that adding more samples it will take longer time. So looking at this waveform in a wave editor, it will be a lot wider than the one we saw with only 128. And this one will have a different pitch. It will have a lower pitch when we have it fewer. Instead of manually setting the number of samples, you can also set the samples to the pitch that have been set here. So if I click, with this pitch we would need 200 samples, and with filter strength of 1 it would look like this. If I press F7 one time, we see we lower the pitch, and when I click this button it will see it will need to be exported with 400 samples to have this pitch, and we would have a different result of the filtering. And if I go all the way down, in this case it would say 1202. And if I go the opposite direction, we see the problem, because this asterisk tell us that the sample rates, the sample count have been clamped. It's because with this high a pitch, we would need less than 128 samples to produce this pitch, and you cannot dial in less than 128 samples in this program. So if I play back the sound, it will still have some anti-aliasing going on because it's not able to filter it enough. It will not be an issue for you because normally you will never export with so few samples. And your sampler software should take care of changing the waveform. But as I said, in this version you can now filter. You can dial in the filter you want. This filtering is not limited only to the view here. When I close this window, when I'm exporting a waveform, I can now choose the filtering here as part of the setup for the export. If you have not done anything, the filter defaults to 0, meaning it's not filtering, but entering a filter strength of 1, you will have this filtering we saw in the viewer, and it will take care of dynamically changing the filter based on the sample rates and the number of samples you have selected. So you only have to think about which filter strings you want to use. Also in this form you can probably see that some of the fields have changed their position and a few new fields have been added. Beside choosing the filtering, you can in this version also choose the number of waveforms to export. In previous version it will always only export one full cycle waveform, and that produced very short waveforms. Typical wave file exported would be a few milliseconds. But depending on this hardware, the software you want to import this sound into, they perhaps not will be able to import such a short waveforms. So in this version you can dial in a higher waveform count. Right now with only one waveform, we see the duration of this one waveform and the size of the data. This size only includes the waveform data, not the header in the file. It's the raw data. But when I choose a bigger value, for example, let's choose 100, you can see that this one waveform based on the sample rate and number of samples will take 2.9 milliseconds, but outputting 100 in one file, it will take 290 milliseconds. And you see down here both the size of the entire file and the size of a single waveform. So you could manually try if you want it to be a second. You simply increase the volume until you get, for example, this one, 346 waveforms would produce a file that would last for 1 second. You are able to choose, as the hint window shows here, between 1 and 2,000 waveforms in one file. Also new in this version, you can choose an analog factor. This analog factor defaults to 0, meaning it will not be active. But what it does is it applies the analogies phase and value converters automatic to your waveform. if we make a new sine wave, you perhaps remember we have this analogish phase converter. If I dial in a large volume, a large variant, you can see its effect. This point should have been here. This point should have been here, and this point down here should have been here. So by adding these and changing the seed value used to seed the randomizer, you see different effects. So this filter will, this phase converter will add some imperfection, in this case to the phase values, so the things are shifting left and right. Normally you will not use such a large values as here, but it's just to show how it works. Likewise, we also have an analogous value converter, so if we increase that also, it will, instead of pushing things left and right, it will push things up and down, so different values here will change the amplitude of the wave. And by doing it as part of the export, by setting it here, it will automatically add that randomness and that imperfection, and you can dial in a value to define how much it should affect the waveform. This value can be set between 0 and 1 in steps of 0.001. So you have 1,000 different values to choose from. Personally, I would go with a low value for some 0.1, 0.2. And you can do it only to one waveform, or you can do it to many waveforms. So for example, exporting 500 waveforms, single cycle waveforms, into one file, you will have 500 different waveforms that are slightly imperfect. So it gives this analog feeling to the waveform. It's not so digital, it's not so perfect. So if you want to use it, dial in a value greater than 0 and set to 0 like here, it will not affect the waveform at all. So this is what have changed to the export of waveform, where I think the filter is probably what people will be using the most. These settings can of course be set here in this window when you export, but they can also be set in your presets. You have the exact same controls here, so instead of manually having to dial in the number, for example, if I always want to filter waveforms, I can simply choose it here. This one is set to the raw format, and for the raw format, most of these controls are disabled. So if this is how I prefer it, I simply click OK, and that will be how I export the next time when I choose that preset. Here it shows how I exported the last time, but choosing that preset, I now see those values from that preset. In previous version, when you wanted to import a waveform into the program, you had to go and make a waveform. You had to choose, it was a hand-drawn waveform, choosing edit, choosing import, then pick the file, and then it was imported. In this version, you can import directly from the tree view. When I right click, I now have this menu item, import, and I pick a random waveform to import. It asks me for a name, and it suggests the name of the file, and I can simply click OK. If I do an import again and choose the same file, which was this, the saw linear 2, yep. Now it automatic appends _1 because there is already a file with that name. And you cannot have two with the same name, so I can import this one as well, and now I have two. And if I double click one of them, you can see it have been imported as a hand-drawn. It's just easier to do the imports, as you don't have to first create the hand-drawn and so on. The next thing is an item suggested by one of the users of this software. When you edit a waveform, let's say this is a hand drawn, so let's change it into something else. Let's say it was, we can randomize it. Let's say it was this one, and I wanted to change something. For example, I wanted to use a shift reducer. And I want to both keep the previous waveform and I want to keep this change. When I click OK, it will override the waveform I had first. But now I can choose Save As. Choosing that, it will suggest the previous name for the one I edited, and again it will automatically add underscore and then incremented number based on what's available. In this case, there was not an _1 already, so that it's what it suggests, and I can simply click OK. So I still have the one I edited, and I had the one I saved using Save As, and I can do that as many times as I want to. Save As, and now this part was the name of the one I edited, so again it simply appends _1 to that name. And I can change the name and or just accept this one, and I have both. So that should be more easy for you to save work that you come up with without replacing the other one. And here we did it for advanced waveform, but it works for other waveforms as well. For example, if I'm editing this compound waveform, I also have a Save As. Here I don't have a partial, so let's create a partial. When I create it, you see I don't have a Save As button. Let's randomize everything. Say I want this one, and I save it. When I edit it, I now have a Save As. If you edit a compound waveform, you know it's built from 4 particles, and if I edit one of those particles, I don't have a Save As, because that Save As would save back to the database, and you cannot do that while you're editing the compound. So here I just have an OK, but I can use the Save As on the compound. So that's the new Save As feature. In version 1.1, I introduced a new waveform in form of the operator waveform. And I have added features to this operator waveform in this version. It's still the same algorithms, but now you can, for each operator, choose which waveform it's based on. In previous version, it was always a sine, but now you can choose about between these 5 different waveforms. You can choose sine, ellipsoid, triangle, square, or saw. For example, I can choose this one to be an ellipsoid, and it changes the output. And for example, this one I can choose to be a triangle, and I get this output instead. Like in previous version, you have still the frequency and you still have the phase shift, but you can also dial in a volume for each of these operators. In this case, you cannot dial in a volume for operator 1, and that will be based on the algorithm in use. in this case, if I change the volume of operator 1, it would just make the generated waveform taller, and since it's automatically normalized, it will give no meaning to allow it to be changed this volume. But as I said, it's based on the algorithm. If I choose another algorithm, for example, this one I can change for 2 and 3, but 1 is still locked. And here, in this case, we use operator 3 to manipulate the phase of operator 1. And also we use operator 3 to manipulate the phase of operator 2. And then those two mixed results are added together. And now it gives meaning to change the volume of 1, because it will be this mix that changes how the resulting waveform will be. And the volume is a value between 0 and 228. So the eagle-eyed of you will see that 628 is pi times 2. But the volume will default to 1.0 as here. So these are the changes to the operator waveform. When you hand drew a waveform, you now have a new draw tool. And it's this new one called lag, and it's kind of a smoothing effect, but it's a different smoothing effect than this one. For example, if I dial in a random waveform and I use lag, I simply draw in this effect, and you see it will change it to this smooth effect. And what it actually does is it uses a running arrays. So it takes a few samples and take the arrays of those and plot that, and then it shifts one sample and take an array again and use that value. And the reason I call it lag is because in the beginning it will be lagging to the right of the original waveform. You can see the orange waveform here in the beginning will be shifted to the right according to the blue one, the original. But in the end, the last part of the waveform will be more or less reversed, because I have made the algorithm so it will always catch up to this exact value you have here. You see, we start at 0 line and we end at the 0 line, and we do that also when we have performed this lag operation. This value you can dial in here. It determines how many samples are used to calculate that average, and a larger value will give you a more smooth waveform. While I still hold the left mouse button pressed, I can change this value using the scroll wheel of the mouse. So here I make the waveform even more smooth by dialing in a larger value. And if I go extreme, here 256, this is how it looks. When I release the mouse, it will normalize this waveform, so it will occupy the full height. So it will change the appearance according to what you see here. So this is how it looks with the extreme. If I go back and I dial in, for example, 8 and draw again, let's choose a bit higher like this, and I let go, and you see it have now smoothed the waveform. And still, like I showed in the beginning, when you double click, you can choose to add a filter strength. And see here we have the waveform without any filtering. And here we see the results with just a filter strength of 1, which should be enough in most cases. You see a little rippling here. Those rippling you will see It's called the Gibbs phenomenon. You will see that when you have very sharp changes where it, for example, if you go from this point directly down to this point, you'll have a lot of ripples up here and down here when you do the filtering. So that was the lag tool. As you can see now, many of the fields have a tooltip window that will appear and show you what you can do and what the button will do. If for some reason you find these tooltips annoying in this version, you can disable them in settings. You have this enable tooltips. I can click it off. By default it will be enabled. The tooltips in this window will remain active even no matter what you choose here, and that's simply because to remind you what these settings does, and hopefully you're not opening this window very often, so it will be less annoying, I guess. Now I have clicked it off. So now when I move my mouse to this view of the waveform, normally it will tell me I could double click or press F1 to hear it. But now I'm not showed that tooltip, and that goes for all of the windows. If I edit this one, there's no tooltip here, and these buttons, there's no tooltip. However, you can use Control Shift F12, and I think it was shown in the tooltip in here. Yeah. Shift Control F12 can be used to toggle the tooltip on off. So now I don't see a tooltip. I can double click this window, so I can press Control Shift F12. Now I have enabled tooltip, and I will see tooltip as long as this window is open. So if I close the window and open again, tooltips are disabled, as I said in settings. So you can disable that, and then you can turn it on with Control F12 when you want it active just for a short while. If you enable it here in the main window, it will be active here in the main window as long as the program runs, or until you press again. And that's because this window is not closing down. But for all other windows, it will only be momentarily as long as that window is open. Personally, I will not disable these tooltips, but again, for those of you who find them annoying, you can now disable them. And beside what I've shown in this video, there are a few more things changed in this version. I have fixed things, for example, in the previous version. When you were playing back audio at the lowest pitch setting, there was clicks in the audio. And also when you change the pitch, you would hear clicks. This have been fixed in this version. And a few other things have been fixed, and there's perhaps also a few small changes I have not mentioned, but you can see it here in the history. So these are the changes in version 1.2.